Hey everybody, my name is Matt Sump. I'm here today with Devin Glass, and we'll be going over the Mastercam 2024 preview webinar. Do note that this is going to be more of a general overview and some highlights of what's coming here in June. We'll be doing more in-depth rollouts, both in person, and then we'll follow up later in the summer with some webinar format for those of you that can't make those events in person. This is the entire agenda, but basically Devin's going to be going over all the 2024 highlights, and I'll be here helping to answer questions.
Well, morning, guys. This is Devin from ShopWare here. I'm one of the applications engineers, do classroom training and on-site training and tech support and all that good stuff here. Like Matt said, we're just going to be going over the highlights. What I did this year is what I've done in previous years, is just go through the what's new, gone through the corporate training to kind of get an idea of how these new features work. Some of these are files that I've just thrown together. Some of them are very simplistic, like just blocks to demonstrate how the feature works. Of course, when we get to later in the year, we'll do a full-fledged rollout where it gives me plenty of time to draw up some really fancy parts and to really go into depth on how these features work. So first thing you're going to probably see when you get into 2024 is the G-View Cube. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click here. When you first open Mastercam 2024, in the bottom left corner, you're going to see this little cube where the gnomon used to be. Well, gnomon's still there. I'm going to make it a little bigger for you guys just so you can see it in this example, because I know it's pretty small on this PowerPoint. And you can see here that this cube gives you the ability to click into different views without necessarily have to go into a right mouse click menu or use a keyboard shortcut. And you've got all these different views for different isometric views: back, right, left, bottom. If you hold some keyboard keys, you can do some fancy stuff where you basically spin it 180 degrees depending on where you click on it, that sort of thing there. So give you guys who are using a laptop and not a mouse a fighting chance to be able to change your different views without necessarily have to go through a right mouse click menu. So very excited to see that. Probably the first thing you're going to see and probably want to play with there. And yeah, and for those of you guys who are used to clicking on the gnomon in the bottom left corner for dynamic plane creation, you still can do that. You just have to click on the gnomon. Just be careful that you don't click on the cube. One last thing I will mention about the cube is it's dependent on the WCS. So on this particular part, you guys may be familiar, we go over in class. We flip it to the bottom and start using the bottom as our new WCS. When you switch your WCS, so too does the cube adjust. So top would then become bottom, bottom would become top, and so on. So get ready to play with that in 2024. This one's a little hard to show off, but transparency now hides inner black edges. The best way I've found to just demonstrate this is I pulled a file from 2023 and 2024. I turned the transparency on, and you can kind of see where I put these arrows. And again, I apologize, these pictures are a little bit on the smaller side, trying to fit them on the slides here. But where I pointed the arrows, back in 2023, these black edges would be very, very, I don't want to say obvious, but they would be showing at all times. And if you have a very, very complex model, a lot of times those black edges would kind of blur together and you have a hard time knowing, well, is this black edge 2 inches deep or 5 inches deep? Well, they made some adjustments in 2024's transparency where it'll hide it a lot better depending on the depth it's at. So those black edges may not be super obstructive. That being said, when you have transparency on, if you're trying to select an edge inside the solid, you still can select those edges just like you could in previous versions. They're just now a little more hidden to feel a little more natural, a little more ghostly than the predecessor here. So it didn't look so much like wireframe shaded. Now this one was kind of a happy surprise. There was no mention of it in the what's new that I could find. I just kind of stumbled upon it when someone from the applications department up in the corporate office just mentioned it. But I'm sure you guys have ran into this before. You're trying to zoom in on a feature and you're just scrolling, or maybe you're a power user and you've been using Zoom window, which I still try to get into practice and using more and more. But now in 2024, if you hold the shift key while you're scrolling your wheel, it will zoom 7 times faster. So in this little video here, I'm just scrolling normally. I'm scrolling into this simple block, then I'm scrolling out with the wheel. You can even see like me reloading my finger there. But now if I hold the shift key and scroll wheel, it rockets to the part. When I hold the shift key and scroll out, it rockets away. So hopefully it's going to make your zoom in a lot faster. Here it is just one more time. Quite a bit of a zoom there. And then if I hold the shift key and then zoom, it's going to be a lot faster. I was told it's 7 times faster than normal zoom. So looking forward to that. Now we're going to get into design enhancements. So for those of you who have been drawing solid holes in Mastercam, we always had the ability to support top edge chamfering basically and filleting, but now we can support bottom edge chamfering and filleting as well. I went ahead and colored them so they're a little more obvious because they were a little kind of hard to see before I did that. But as you can see in the hole creation tab, we can now establish a top edge treatment and a bottom edge treatment, and they can be completely separate. So you can have a chamfer on the top, a fillet on the bottom, that sort of thing. And if you were to save this into your templates, this hole will retain that information for future uses. So if that needs to be a fillet on the bottom, whenever you're doing a counterboard like this, you can save this out, and it's always going to have that fillet. Now, years ago, we introduced that solid hole creation tool, and it was super great when it came to making, a series of counterboard holes or a series of countersunk holes, and et cetera, with the included tip on the bottom. But every once in a while, what would happen is you would have a part that has a series of holes, like we see here, a series of holes in a row, and you want to just change one of them. Well, now in 2024, if that is the case and they're all grouped together, you can right-click on the hole operation, explode the whole operation into its separate parts. So in this case, 6 separate operations. And then you can edit one at a time. So that way, if say these 2 edge holes need to be a specific size or a different size than what was originally drawn, you can now change them without having to worry about changing the other related holes. So again, there, if you right click on this whole operation in the solids history tree, you can hit explode operation, and it's going to break it up into 6 or however many holes there are. Now, for those of you guys who've used Mastercam for quite a while, this is going to look very, very familiar. You're going to get a case of deja vu here. Years and years ago, we used to have a tool called trim, break, and extend. So basically, you have the trim to entities tool, the break tool, the extend/shorten tool, all basically under one roof. I want to say it was about 2020, 2021, they started breaking those functions out into their own separate options. I mentioned in a previous rollout years ago that my theory of why they did that was so that way you could establish keyboard shortcuts to every function. You want to divide, delete, keyboard shortcut. You want to trim, break, extend, keyboard shortcut. And you could just jump back and forth rather than going into one single menu and changing back and forth between what kind of method you want to use. Well, a few years passed and people have been asking to get something like that back, that kind of one function with everything under one roof. And sure enough, we have brought out the dynamic trim in 2024. So we still have the trim to entities and the divide tool and the modify length like we've had the last few years. But now we have dynamic trim, which basically takes all that same functionality, puts it under one roof for those of you guys who want everything under one roof like this. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Again, nothing new if you haven't, if you have used Mastercam for a very long time, just bring it back an old goodie. Okay. Another thing that we've been kind of enhancing over the last couple of years is the note text and the design or in the drafting text. You guys may have ran into when you try to make a note and try to give leaders to that note. In 2023, when you hit add, you can add a single note or leader at a time, but then you had to go back and click add again for a second one, click add again for a third, click add again for a fourth, and so on. They've kind of improved the workflow of that a little bit better, as you can see right here. Once I click add, it's now adding for each click I do. I now have keyboard shortcuts where if I hit the escape key, it's going to or delete the last one I made. If I hit the enter key, it's going to accept them. So there I'm hitting the escape key. I'm going to pick a couple other ones. So I'm not hitting add every single time I want to add a leader. And on top of that, in 2023, when you'd move the note, the leaders would not update automatically. Now in 2024, they'll update automatically and show you what it's going to look like before you let go of the note. So definitely a workflow improvement there. On the topic of drafting, we now have a new drafting panel. So again, for those of you guys who've been using dimensioning tools in Mastercam for quite a while, the the way to modify your scale, the way to modify your leaders, your arrows, your line styles and all that within the dimensioning page was you had to go to the Advanced tab, click into Advanced Options, which basically was a shortcut into the configuration. You would change in the configuration, but that wouldn't change what you have on your screen until you check out. So you didn't really have a live preview. Well, now in 2024, we have a new drafting panel. So if you guys have been seeing the last couple of years, we've been kind of going for this more panel layout. And what we've essentially done is taken all those config settings and pulled them into here. That being said, you can still edit them within the configuration, but now it's a lot easier and a lot more accessible to go in here and change your scale, your leaders, your arrow types, et cetera, within the drafting page. And on top of that, it's going to update automatically. Rather than before, you'd have to change all your settings, check out the config, see if it made a difference or did what you wanted, then rinse and repeat until you got the kind of arrow type you were wanting. Now we're going to get into the Toolpath enhancements. Now these are just general Toolpath enhancements. They kind of apply across the board except for a few asterisks, which I'll talk about here. First, the Mastercam developers heard you loud and clear. 2023, when we switched over to the new machine group properties, one of the biggest hits we took was we switched over from our old method of creating stock to bounding box method. That was in a hope to reuse, functionality from the bounding box tool and just bring it into the machine group properties. But for a lot of people, me included, we were really missing the ability to just pick two corners and call it a day. Well, sure enough, now in 2024 in the stock definition page, we can now define a simple rectangle, which have all the same controls we had in previous versions, a simple cylinder, which had all the same controls as previous versions. And it takes me a second to get to here, but we also can make an initial rectangle. I can click on the faces and push and pull, which is something we couldn't do before. But if you've been using Bounding Box for a while, this is part of the Bounding Box feature. And then finally, we have corner to corner again, where you just pick one corner, the opposite corner, it grabs that size there. So we brought that back, including a bunch of new controls within that stock in order to create stock similar to how we did in the older versions. That being said, if you guys got used to using Bounding Box in 2023, that function is still in there. You can still use it. We just brought back some of the old stuff from 2022 and prior. Now, this one is probably one of the features I'm most excited for. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with how a stock model works, a stock model is an operation that acts as a checkpoint to tell Mastercam this is what my stock should look like at this point. So I don't have to verify ops 1 through 10. I could just jump right to op 12 per se. But for those of you who have used stock models, you know the process where you create a stock model. And if you want to use that stock model, you have to go into simulator options, select that stock model, green checkout, then verify your operations. Well, now in 2024, if you have a stock model selected as your first operation, Mastercam will assume to use that stock model. So in this case, I just verified op 3 without the stock model. It went back to its original cube. But if I select op 2 and 3, making that stock model my first operation, Mastercam recognizes, okay, we've selected a stock model as your first operation. We're going to verify with that stock model. Now, if you grab multiple stock models, only the first stock model is going to be used. If you grab an operation above a stock model, then it won't recognize it. It's only going to see the stock model if it's the first operation you have selected. But this is really going to save you a lot of time from going into the simulator options page and picking your stock model over and over rather than just grabbing them. In fact, I'm so excited about this that this is actually going to change a little bit of how I order my stock models a little bit, where normally I put the stock model, like in this example, I put the stock model before my next toolpath group for op 2. I'm likely now going to start putting the stock model after the toolpath group, so it's at the very beginning of each operation or each site I'm doing. So again, very excited about this one. Looking forward to using this one in there. And as you can see in my parentheses, it didn't flat out say that it was only for mill. I did some digging and found out that it only works for mill and router for that instance. For you guys who are using router, it works for router as well. but it doesn't work for lathe, and I haven't really got it to work in wire, at least in this current form of the beta. So lathe and wire, unfortunately, won't be able to do this, but mill and router, you can. I haven't tested it in mill turn, but I'm assuming it would work if you use milling toolpaths, but I'll have to check that. Now, this is kind of hard to show, but I think it's going to be a very powerful addition to 2024 when it comes to doing repeat work. So if something I preach in class is that you should always, always, always import a toolpath if this feature is similar to a part that you've done, a couple months back, or maybe this is a family of parts. Why go through the trouble of recreating that entire toolpath from scratch when you could just steal it from another part? Well, this is kind of taking that a step further. Let's imagine that I've just created a raster out of the blue, and I wanted to kind of pull in the settings of that raster from a different file. Well, hey, we can do that. So in this video, what I've done is I'm changing the step over. I'm doing something super simple. I'm changing the step over to 10th thou. I hit the save icon, and for those of you guys who've used the save icon before, you can already tell that this is a different interface. So now we can tell it whether to save to the defaults or save to a specific operations file. You can see there I'm saving it as raster test. After it's done saving, I completely close out of this toolpath, close out of this file. Give me a second to catch up here. I'm going to bring in a mill. I'm going to do a raster toolpath. Almost picked waterline by accident there. And you can already see that I'm demonstrating that if you hit the little drop down next to the load file, you can actually pick from a drop down of all the rasters in this current operation file you have selected. You can also click on the icon itself and it will pull up that same UI we saw before. But in here, you can just save your operations and call them back whenever you want. So the behavior there is a little bit different, but I think it's going to be a really powerful tool to help you just jump in and grab your parameters from another file. And in this example, I am saving to an operations file, but you can grab another Mastercam part file. So for those of you guys who've been through my class, you see that I don't really use the operation file that much. I mostly am grabbing part files when I'm importing. Now, I think this one's going to be a lot more helpful when it comes to your normal 2D user, but it does apply across the board. Lathe, drafting, solid creation, all that. But essentially, when you're in the chain manager, you get to this point here where you'd have this manager up and you had to try to figure out which chain was the bad one. You had to go through the list, find one. And if you had 50 of them, they were really annoying there. But now you can actually go out and click on the chain and it's going to select in the list. On top of that, if you double click on the arrow, it's going to flip that specific chain. So again, if you go in here and I double click on the long arrow, it's going to reverse the direction of that chain. So it's going to go clockwise instead of counterclockwise in this case. If I double click on the small arrow, it's going to change the cutter comp. And you can see that's being applied to all of them because really you only have, you only have one cutter comp for this particular toolpath. So very helpful, going to really speed up workflow when you just want to grab one chain that's having an issue. You can just double click them right out the bat instead of having to figure out which one of them is in the list, then right click on that one in the list and then hit reverse. So look out for that. All right, so that's some general toolpath enhancements. Now we're getting a little bit more on the lathe enhancement side, and as I do in all previous years, the lathe enhancements are going to be applied to lathe and mill turn, and the mill turn page that will come later will only really apply to mill turn. So just a heads up there for you guys who are using lathe but don't necessarily have mill turn. So first, in the semi-finish within the dynamic rough, we kept running into issues where you would have a good lead in, lead out for the roughing, but you wouldn't really have a great lead in, lead out for the semi-finish. So specifically for dynamic rough, at this point, I'm hoping to see it come to the regular rough soon. We now have two separate lead in, lead outs. We have one for the roughing, one for the semi-finish. Now, of course, these will only be used if you turn on the semi-finish within the dynamic rough toolpath in lathe. But at this point there, this could give you a lot more control over the trajectory for the lead in and lead out of the finish, where before you were just kind of stuck with whatever the roughing was set to. in previous versions of Mastercam, we kept running into issues where if you're using solid turn profile chaining, so you didn't make a turn profile from wireframe or into wireframe, excuse me, and you were just using a solid and letting the solid create the profile within the toolpath. We ran into an issue a couple times where if you had a very, very, very small feature, the tolerance would be set too large and would ignore it. So say you had like a chamfer that was 20 thou wide, and you created a solid chain, it would ignore that chamfer if it was below a certain tolerance amount. And an older version of Mastercam, what we had to essentially do is go into or stop what we were doing, go into the configuration and change the tolerance within the configuration. Now though, in 2024, they've added the tessellation tolerance right here into the chaining dialog. So if for whatever reason, if you need to have a much tighter representation of your part for, say, this job you're doing, maybe there is like a 5/10 chamfer, you can drop that tolerance down. Just keep in mind though, the smaller this tolerance is, the longer it's going to take to process that turn profile. The larger this is, the shorter time it's going to take to process that turn profile, because it's going to be making some assumptions here and there. But by default, it's set to 1 thou, and you will now have control of it within the chaining dialog. And again, that only really applies to solid chaining, doesn't really apply to wireframe chaining, as the wireframe is going to be absolute to whatever you see there, and there already is some chaining tolerance controls within the wireframe chaining side of things. So just for solid chaining on this one. Next is variable depth. Now, for those of you who have not used variable depth before, it's in the roughing toolpath, rough turning toolpath, not necessarily the dynamic rough. But the variable depth was a method in which we could prevent notching with very, very hard materials. So what it would do is, rather than say, let's say we're cutting our diameter down, instead of coming straight across in Z, straight across in Z, straight across in Z, what it would do is cut a taper first, then cut straight. And the idea was that the contact point of the tool would be constantly changing, which would then increase tool life on much more nasty materials. Nothing new. That variable depth's been in there for quite a while. However, we have adjusted the 2024, where back in 2023, you could only go from negative 25% of the depth to positive 25% of the depth. Now in 2024, we can go from negative 100% of the depth to positive 100% of the depth. So we've increased the amount you can use that variable depth by, 75% both ways. So definitely just increasing that amount for those of you who have to use variable depth, or else your inserts are just going to die left and right. Now we'll get into mill-turn enhancements. So this stuff is unfortunately unavailable in the lathe as of right now. But if you guys are familiar with mill-turn, some of the stuff you really can't do in the lathe anyway, or the lathe product anyway. So first things first, last year we introduced B-axis turning, which was gave us the ability to change our tool angle or B-axis head within the machine during the cut. Something that was asked for quite a while there, and we're happy to bring that into Mastercam. But it's now the second year B-axis turning is around, and we now have some, comments and enhancements for that feature. So the first thing is modify vectors. So to control the tool tilt, there was really only two methods in 2023. There was manual, where you basically created vector lines at every point of tilt you wanted, which required some geometry to be made, or automatic, where essentially Mastercam would try to figure out what kind of tilt we were after. Now, a lot of times we would try to stay normal to the surface it was cutting with some collision checking in there. But now we have something kind of in between, where we let Mastercam automatically determine the tilt, but then we can adjust whatever vectors it created. So rather than us making the wireframe, we let the toolpath make the vectors, so that way we can adjust them within the toolpath itself. So you can see here, again, this is not the best tool for this example. It was just something I threw together. In reality, I should have roughed it first. But you can see there that it's tilting. It's set to automatic. I didn't create any vector lines. It's set to automatic right there. I can do manual and actually create edges or vector lines. But here, I can go to modified, click on that cursor, And now I can adjust what Mastercam came up with. So maybe I need to just tweak something over here, tweak something over there, that sort of thing. And I can tweak whatever Mastercam came up with there. So kind of in between automatic and manual, and that is the modified. This one I didn't really bother making a video about. One thing that was missing from the B-axis turning was the adjust stock ability. We didn't really have adjust stock and all the controls we had in B-axis turning like we did in the roughing. So they introduced adjust stock also into the fray there, into the B-axis turning, which is nice to see there. This one's very interesting. I'm hoping that we see more of this kind of trickle its way into other toolpaths and other lathe toolpaths for that matter. But this is their first attempt at a graphical method to identify the usable portion of your insert, as the bullet point would suggest there. So in this example here, you know, again, this is not the best example because, again, I just threw a toolpath on here, but I can actually take these endpoints and drag them, and it's going to change what is considered the quote-unquote insert for this. So if I go into manual, I can take one of these edges, I can drag them across, and then say, okay, you can cut all the way on this top edge, but not on this bottom edge here. And for B-axis turning, this is super helpful because it helps us control the amount of tilt that Mastercam is working with and what is allowed to make contact with the stock. So that way we don't have one of those situations where the tool backs in to an area because it tried to tilt backwards too far. So again, looking forward to utilizing that, and I'm hoping that sucker makes its way into other toolpaths as well in the future. Now, this is another component support that I'm happy to see. A couple years ago, you guys may have saw that we added steady rest support in mill turn. Well, now we've taken it a step further, and we now have turret-mounted angled milling heads to support. So I know it's a mouthful, but essentially it's for tool types like these where you have this specified angle, both manual or automatic. So if it's one of those situations where you have to set it first, lock it down, and then run the program, you can do it that way. And from my understanding, it can also support automatic if your machine is capable of that. But as of right now there, I'm just kind of pretending like it's a manual one. And just going across, this is mounted in the turret, can be set to different angles, all that good stuff. And this can be supported in the upper or the lower. So it doesn't necessarily be one or the other. It can be in both, really. Now we're going to circle back to 2D milling enhancements. One of the big things you're going to see this year is called process hole. Now, if you guys watched my previous webinars, specifically like 2023 and 2022, there was these rumors that they got something cooking where Mastercam will be able to identify your holes and then go through a set list of processes. So there's rumors about that for quite a while, and that has taken the shape of what's called now process hole. So how process hole works is you create a series of toolpaths. Let's say I'm doing a tapping routine for a 1/2" 13. It can really be any part file you want. It could be just one of your normal job files, or you can make a template file that has a bunch of them. But essentially, you would pick a hole that's sized for that job. Then you would program the spot drill, program the tap drill, and then program the tap. And you have it all in one toolpath group, essentially. You save that file, and then this is where my video picks up. So where my video picks this up is I go into what's called process hole. It's in the toolpath toolbar, and I then pick the holes there. So I control click to grab all the similar size holes, which are all drawn as a 1/2" 13 tap drilled hole. Then I select the file I'm looking for. Now I cut the video because I had to go searching for it. But essentially it's identified, okay, in this other part file, this is the same size hole as what you did for the tap drilling routine. So in that second page, I kind of blew through it. It showed the spot drill I did, the tap drill, and the tapping. I can control the clearance plane for this particular part. The depths are going to change automatically. You can see it's already doing the tap drill there. And then it goes back to do the taps. Well, maybe I don't like the peck drill that it's doing for this particular file. I can go back into this one toolpath, right click in the tap drill, edit it, And then bam, I'm in the parameters of that tap drill and I can adjust it right here. So you can kind of think of process drill as a nice, neat little package that's tied up with a bow that has all these hole making operations for these particular holes. Now, this is not just limited to tap drilling. It's not just limited to 3 operations. Like I said, you could do it with any hole making operation. So if you had, say, a process that takes like 5 different drilling tool paths, like maybe you're doing a reaming and then maybe you're counter boring it and blah, 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 blah. You can do all that. And as long as they're all selecting the same size hole and you've saved them, you can pull that whole process right back. And from my understanding, you can also import a process hole as well. And it's all that information is retained within this one operation. So kind of gone are the days of having, 50 operations for, 20 holes or so. Even that's conservative. You just have one operation that has a routine built into it that goes through there. And again, you'll probably be seeing more information on this as time goes on. In the rollout, this is probably going to be one of my bigger points of showing up how to make this, how to do this. But essentially, you just grab a file from before, and as long as you selected a solid hole, that part is important. You had to grab the entire hole feature, and they're the same size between 2 files. You can bring in that whole process into a future file down the road. So there's actually a sample file where it doesn't have any tool paths, but basically it just has a range of holes going across the solid body. And the idea is that when you get a hold of that, you can basically process each hole yourself and then save that file out. And from then on out, you have basically a huge Mastercam file with all these different hole scenarios that you can pull from. So looking forward to process hole. Biggest caveat I see there is that you have to grab the entire hole feature. Therefore, they have to be defined as solid holes. Thankfully, with the last few years of enhancements, you have the ability to identify solid holes from other CAD sources or from a dumb solid. So it definitely makes that part a lot easier. But making that solid hole feature or identifying that solid hole feature is very important for that step for it to understand what the depths need to be for each of those. So definitely look forward to that and playing around with that in the future. This is also another big thing. The drill team has been very, very busy this year. So there's linking parameters, plane visibility. This is only available in the hole making, but as you can see at the very start, the linking page has changed a little bit, and this will be across the board. All the same information is here, but what they've done is they've kind of consolidated some of the previous pages, like tip comp is now on this page, subprogram and stuff like that is kind of now here. They've made the absolute incremental associative a drop down now. They have different check boxes here to show what you're looking for. But what I want to point out is in this video, by default, when you're doing a hole making operation, if I move the page to the side, you can see it's showing me physical planes for each of these. So for my depth, for my top stock, for my retract, and they update in real time. So I just changed my depth to -1/2 inch, went down there. I can visibly see how deep they're going. And when I measure a point off something, it's going to adjust as well. You can also actually click on the planes and move them on the screen. So if you're trying to check against a toe clamp, you can literally just go out, grab that plane, and just check them. So here you're going to see I'm going to grab a couple more holes. I try to make the screen a little bit more square to fit into the PowerPoint at this point, but at this point it was kind of I kind of was having trouble with it. Didn't really work out. So I gave up on that endeavor. But again, you can see now, because the retract and the top stock is still set to incremental, but the depth and the clearance are absolute, it's going to spread the absolute linking across the board, across all those holes, where each hole is going to be separate from each other. And again, you can still change it. You can click on the plane. So this is definitely going to help for those of you guys who have 2 monitors, and you have your parameters on one screen, you have your Mastercam on another, because you'll be able to just click and drag these planes very easily without, in this case, my parameters getting in the way. So again, very nice visualization. From my understanding, this is only available in the hole making. There is plans to hopefully grab this and move it on to other places in the software, such as like contour, dynamic mill, and so on, like the other 2D toolpaths. But for right now, it's only for the hole making stuff. So again, the hole making team has been pretty dang busy this year, as they have been a couple last years. But yeah, stay tuned for that. Okay, so this one's kind of a small one here. Area mill contour now has some more direction control. So we now have open chain or direction controls, where before I believe you only had one way. Now you have one way or zigzag. But probably what's going to be the most change, or the biggest change in area mill, is the fact that we now have a lot more control when it comes to our leads. So before, your HST leads was only limited to vertical arc entry, vertical arc exit. That's it. But now in 2024, we're getting kind of the same stuff we're used to seeing in the 3D side, where you can also get a horizontal arc entry, a horizontal arc exit, a ramp angle, a sweep angle, all that good stuff. You can see by default, it's going to zero out all of the horizontal arc entry and exit, ramp angle, sweep angle. All the sweep angles 90 degrees, but as long as the ramp angle is 0, then that will matter. That way, when you open up an older file or you try to go use area mill, you're not going to see any behavior by default that you haven't already seen. So that's just more added control that you will get in 2024 for area mill users. This one was a little hard for me to kind of wrap my head around. I had to do some kind of reading and some kind of comparison to figure out what was happening here. But essentially, I stole this screenshot from the help file, and essentially what's happening is there's a checkbox within the cut parameters of the dynamic mill and the OptiRough that will say maximize engagement. And what it's doing is, rather than gradually leading onto the part, and for those of you guys who've used dynamic mill, you probably know what I'm talking about here, it's going to slowly increase the amount of chip load until it reaches its step over amount, and then it's going to try to stick with that step over as much as it can. So if I bring on my laser pointer here, you can kind of see that it starts here and gradually starts to chew its way in until it meets its step over, and it just keeps cutting further and further and further in. Maximize engagement is going to be a lot more of an aggressive entry. So you go from 0 chip load to your defined chip load, or your step over, very, very quickly. You just go right into the material, essentially. So it's not ideal for harder materials, but stuff like aluminum, I can imagine this is going to save you a lot of time, because you don't have to wait for this gradual entry. You can just jump right in the software. You can see it just takes a hard turn and goes right into the material there. So definitely worth trying out, definitely worth playing with. It's going to bring up a few situations where it could save you a pass or two, because it's going to be taking on the material a lot sooner than it normally would. But by default, it is turned off. So just a heads up there. It should maintain the same behavior as it did in previous versions, unless you specifically check maximize engagement in the cut parameters page. Sorry, I don't have a screenshot of that. Another small one here is called roll-in clearance. And one of the things we added years ago was the ability to do an arc entry with facing toolpaths. But now in 2024, we can create or set a clearance amount, which basically offsets that arc outward. So that way it's not engaging the material the moment it starts arcing in. So gives it a little bit of a distance between the part and the tool as it starts to arc in there. Again, I'm not a big user of roll-in myself, but for those of you guys who are using roll-in, this might help with insert life as well. Now we're going to get into the mill 3D enhancements. First, this one caught me way off guard. I was not expecting to get some enhancements to Swept 2D. Don't get me wrong, I love Swept 2D, but definitely a happy surprise to see that it gets some more enhancements. So Swept 2D can now do zigzag passes as well as one way. And on top of that, it can actually do some roughing. So for those of you guys who don't necessarily have a 3D license, for simplistic features like this fillet I've drawn here, you could get away with doing some roughing with Swept 2D now in 2024. So you can see there you define a start Z and an end Z and what kind of step down you want, and it's going to break that up into pieces like it shows here. On top of that, you have zigzag in one way, so definitely going to speed up if you don't want to do one pass at a time, or vice versa. So definitely a happy surprise there. Really caught me the most off guard of all these new enhancements here.
And a little tip there, Devin. I don't know about you, but if any feature that you're trying to machine is perfectly circular, I still think Swept 2D is the best toolpath.
Yes, it's certainly going to be the fastest because it's really in its core a very simplistic concept. It's just taking two chains, basically this arc, and it's just sweeping, hence the name, this arc across here. Really, this solid's only here for visualization's sake. This toolpath doesn't really need any solid, so if your solid has any gaps or errors or issues, Swept 2D doesn't care, and all the wireframe toolpaths doesn't care. And I think this is a really great addition for those of you guys who don't necessarily have a 3D license too, because all the wireframe toolpaths are available to 2D customers. This one's a kind of a small one, but for those of you guys who've used multi-axis, you might remember that we have the ability in some toolpaths, like I believe Parallel has it. I think Morph also can do it, where you can say either cut it or cut. Yeah, excuse me. Order the cuts by lanes or by regions, and it was just two different methods of sorting. Well, now in raster, we have something very similar. We have clusters and lanes, which works the same way. Where if you do lanes, even if there's a gap between them, it's going to cut across to the other side, basically, and it's going to keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth like you're used to. But now we have the ability to do clusters, where say if there's a gap between two features, it's not going to basically cut this X all the way across, then this X all the way across, and then this X all the way across. It's going to cut this little section out, then cut this little section out, then cut this little section out. I realize I'm putting up hand gestures that none of you guys can see, but it's basically a similar method to sort what it's going to cut. Do you cut sections, or do you cut one lane all the way across? No questions asked. Lanes is definitely the old behavior. Clusters is the new behavior. Definitely test it out, and we'll definitely have a live example of that later in the future. Now, I just mentioned how you guys using multi-axis might be familiar with cluster versus lanes, but another thing you might be well familiar with in multi-axis is the ability to have a specific first lead in and last lead out. This was something that I really used all the time in multi-axis and really missed when I started going back to 3D. Well, now in 3D toolpaths, we have a separate page for in the case you want a specific first lead in and a specific last lead out. So, this might be a situation where you can get away with a really tiny lead in, really tiny lead out on the on most of your cutting. But really, at the very beginning, you want to be very careful. You want to do a really gradual lead in to make sure that when you're at the machine, it's going to enter the material fine. It's not going to have any problems. You can hit the E-stop if something goes wrong. All that control is now here for specifically the first and the last leads there. So that's on all the HST 3D toolpaths there. Next is critical depths. So I kind of called this one. I was joking with one of my coworkers that I kind of called this where if you go back to one of our rollouts, I wanted to say it was 2022's rollout, they added something called critical depths to the waterline, which basically would, when enabled, identify flats in your part and just cut those flats essentially. Because in situations like this picture, depending on what your step down is, it's only going to cut between those step downs. It's not going to recognize that there's a flat unless you had add cuts turned on. I mentioned years ago back in 2022 that I wouldn't be surprised if it made its way into area rough, because they work very similar when it comes to slicing. And sure enough, it did. In 2024, we now have critical depth controls in the area rough toolpath. So you can see in this picture, with it turned off, it's going to just completely ignore the flat. It's just going to keep minding its own business, cutting at the depths that I've defined. But when I turn it on, I could say include flats or manual, where I manually pick the flats I wanted to cut. And it's going to adjust the step down ever so slightly in order to cut the flats and land on the flat each time. Technically, you're not going to be doing a constant step down because it's going to, shrink one or two of them in order to make it work, or add a couple extra passes in there. But this will ensure that you are cutting your flats at your designed or defined step stock to leave there. Now, next is the waterline add partial cuts. And for those of you guys who are familiar with waterline, you may already know waterline's Achilles heel, and that is when it comes to shallow features. So in this picture right here, I get a really, really, really nice finish on the outside walls, but when I try to cut this shallow flat, because of how the Z is being sliced, it really doesn't leave a favorable finish on the top. It's doing kind of more of an XY step over than actually a Z step down. And because of that, our surface finish on the top is gonna pay for it. Now, you could avoid that top face altogether. You could just click on it and set it as avoidance. But ideally, I'd like to cut it with the waterline as well. So for years and years and years, we had this option called add cuts. And what add cuts would do is it would monitor the X and Y step over to make sure that if our tool ever moved too far in X and Y, it was going to create another depth pass right there, right then and there, to ensure that our shallow sections doesn't have a poor finish. The downside of this is, as you can maybe see there, is yes, it's adding more depth cuts, but that's being applied all around the part. So now on the walls where I had, a nice consistent step down, which was fine by me, now all of a sudden at this top section where that shallow is, I'm getting these very, very tight step downs. And while that wouldn't really be a huge issue when it comes to surface finish, it would take a lot of machine time to cut those. So definitely was a downside with waterline. And again, waterline's Achilles heels was always shallower sections, which add cuts was trying to prevent. Now in 2024, there's another checkbox in add cuts called allow partial cuts. And you can see this is kind of the best of both. It's identifying the XY step over on the shallow sections, but it's not being applied across the entire part. So now the walls are that consistent step down that I was looking for, but now the shallow section is going to be much, much finer. And for me, that checkbox is going to be kind of a no-brainer moving forward with add cuts, because do I care if it's a partial cut? No, I don't really care. It's going to do the lead off, lead back on. That's okay with me, just as long as I'm not wasting a lot of travel on those walls where it just so happens to be in line with the steeper or with the shallower areas. This one's a pretty quick one too. We for a long time did not have avoidance geometry for the pencil toolpath, but now we do. So in this example, I'm trying to cut around this corner radius here, but I have these toe clamps in the way. And in previous versions of Mastercam, this was kind of a tricky problem we would have. Excuse me. This kind of tricky problem we'd have where we'd have to use containment boundaries or get fancy with creating surfaces that didn't quite go that far. We had to get really clever when it came to avoiding these toe clamps. But now in 2024, you can just grab the toe clamps as avoidance, and the toolpath will recognize and avoid them. So not really new functionality in terms of Mastercam as a whole, but very happy to see that make its way to the pencil toolpath as well. All right, now we're getting into multi-axis. So as almost every year, we've done a bit of enhancements to the pocketing toolpath. This year, we've added an automatic tool tilt for finishing. So when you're going with a finishing paths on the pocketing toolpath and multi-axis, you now have an automatic method instead of having to define what the tilt's going to be at all times. So essentially giving Mastercam the wheel and saying, hey, figure out what would be a good tilt to cut these features. Now, as you guys probably recall from my previous rollouts and webinars, whenever I hear the word automatic, I get a little weary. But from what I can tell, the automatic tilting strategy is pretty common sense so far from what I've seen Mastercam do. It hasn't really done anything wacky from my experience. So I'm very optimistic that this automatic is going to be a really quick tool to help speed up your toolpathing or your programming process for tilting there. On the flip side, though, pocketing now has the capability to do 3-axis roughing. So in the past, you were kind of stuck with 5-axis from my understanding when you were doing roughing. Now you can switch to a 3-axis roughing method. And, you probably heard us say this before, the less axes that are moving, the more rigid your setup's going to be. and this is just more proof to that fact. So in this case, you can lock pocketing down into a 3-axis mode, so it's not moving the A and the C if it doesn't have to, or whatever combination of rotaries you have. Blade Expert also got an enhancement. It got a checkbox called Full Collision Check. You can see it right here. So this one's a little hard to visualize, but for those of you who've used Blade Expert before, you may have noticed in the past that while Blade Expert was really, really good at avoiding collisions, every great once in a while you notice that it just barely clips a portion of the holder, or just barely clips a portion of the shank, that sort of stuff. And what was happening was, in an effort to speed up the processing, Mastercam in the background was simplifying your tool and your holder, essentially, in order for this toolpath to not take a long time to process. Well, they were weighing the pros and cons of just switching back to a long processing time and safer travel. If you guys are familiar with the checkbox in other multi-X toolpaths called slow and safe calculation, it's kind of the same concept. While they were weighing whether or not to switch over to a longer toolpath calculation time but a safer calculation method when it came to collision checking, they decided to go ahead and give you the power to decide, do you want fast generation with the potential that there might be a little bit of a clipping here and there, which you would hopefully see in the verify and correct with other parameters, or do you want it to take a little bit longer to calculate but be a little more careful when it comes to collision checking, essentially? So you can turn this on. It's going to take a little bit longer to process, but it'll be a little more careful. Leave it off. It's going to be the same behavior as before. It's going to be a little faster with it off there. But there could be a chance where, because it was simplifying things in the background, it could have clipped something. So definitely something to watch out for, especially if you're recognizing a crash in Blade Expert. Next, we have deburr enhancements. Now, there's a couple small iterations we changed with the UI, but the biggest thing you're probably going to notice is, depending on your method, specifically 5-axis continuous, 5-axis simultaneous, normal to contour, we now have this added checkbox called avoid contact point on tip. What we noticed was, when you set it to normal to contour, we recognized that the lollipop tools or ball and mills or what have you will every once in a while would try to cut with the very, very tip of the tool, which isn't proper. You really want to be cutting with the side of the tool or towards the bottom of the tool, not at the very end of the tool. So this checkbox just tells the algorithm, hey, if you can help it, try to avoid contacting the very, very tip of the tool, because really we're not getting any leverage down there, and so therefore it won't provide as good of a cut as it would if it cut with the side of the tool. So turning that on just tries to suggest the algorithm to not go ham and cut with every portion of the tool. It tries to avoid the tip there. And the last thing I have here for multi-axis is for the machine angle added to unified. So when you're using the plane method for unified, and you're using, I believe, Z WCS or X and Y WCS method, you now have the control over how it slices up the toolpath in what direction, similar to a raster, essentially, where you can say, I don't want to cut it in X, I want to cut it in Y. So you could set this to 90 degrees to rotate that around, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of see in this demonstration there. So a very small enhancement made to the people using the unified plane method of cutting there, to have a little more control over how they're rotating their tool motion. And that is really the biggest highlights in 2024 that we have pulled together here for you. That being said, there's a lot of other small additions made in Mastercam 2024 that you can definitely see in the what's new as shown in this PowerPoint here. So don't be afraid to look up what's new on the 2024 there, because there might be a small little thing that we didn't feel was worth bringing up in here, but could definitely apply to your guys' situation.
Thanks a lot, Devin. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.